my recommendation to you, stop following a recipe when it comes to how much flour to add. Get your liquid, all your other ingredients into your bowl first, and then slowly start adding your flour until all of it starts to form into a ball and it's only slightly tacky.
Welcome to Everyday Homesteading, the show for busy families who want more self-sufficiency without burning out. I'm Josh.
And I'm Carolyn from Homesteading Family. And in every episode, we share time-tested knowledge on topics from growing and preserving your food to raising livestock to herbal medicine and anything homesteading in between.
Let's jump in.
I really want to dive into something that I feel like is really, really foundational to a homesteading life, to a homesteading kitchen, and it teaches us a skill that we really need to know when we walk into homesteading, and that is actually making bread. And I know maybe that feels like a big claim when it comes to making bread, but I think that this is just something that we have to understand, that making bread teaches us about working with living things, and it's different than working with something that's just a cookie cutter industrialized product. And when we make this shift, when we get into making bread by using technique and feel and by reading the dough, instead of just trying to use somebody's recipe or just trying to make it a skill that either you have or you don't have, then we actually open up a whole world to ourselves that we need to have in order to be able to really understand homesteading. So, lots of big theory wrapped up in the basics of making bread. We're also going to be covering the basic pieces of bread making that you've probably missed if you've just tried to follow a bread making recipe. We're going to be talking about the techniques that you need to learn. So, that's all coming up in just a minute. But first, I want to take a moment and thank today's sponsor, which is American Blossom Linens. You know, for something that you spend a third of your life on, sheets are often highly toxified. I actually looked up some of the common chemicals in average bed sheets. Okay. You guys, in general, there is formaldehyde, which is a known human carcinogen. So it's causing cancer. There's the PFAS, which is the forever chemicals. These are linked to cancer, specifically kidney, testicular, and prostate cancer, to hormone disruption, and to reduced immune function, liver damage, like all these different things. What about the flame retardants that are in them? Those are endocrine disruptors, reproductive fertility disruptors, neurotoxins. Like, you guys, the list goes on. And these are things that are found in the sheets you're sleeping on. When I hear people say, like, oh, I just get the cheap sheets, I kind of want to cringe because I'm like, you're spending a third of your life breathing in and sucking in these toxins. Having clean sheets is something, and I mean clean from toxins, not just clean from dirt or something like that. Those are great. Clean sheets are great. We like clean sheets. But having toxin-free sheets are something that is just so incredibly beneficial and important for your health. A lot of you guys know I've been in a detox journey for a couple years, and I've had to really get serious about, like, where do I spend most of my time and how do I get those environments to be low toxin environments. American Blossom Linens has completely helped me do this in my bedding. I sleep at least 7.5 hours every night, and Josh and I love reading in bed. So we're often in bed for an additional hour a day. So that makes a lot of time spent on either something that's helping us to have a really good, healthy system and giving our body a chance to repair, or with something that's actually toxifying us. So American Blossom Linens are completely clean, completely chemical free, organic, made in the United States, which not only indicates their quality, but also indicates their transparency. This is really important because you actually know that they are living by what they claim. And of course, they are sheets that are going to last you for a really, really long time. We've had ours for several years now, and they're not even close to having any sort of threadbare issues. They're really great quality sheets. So if you are serious about cutting toxins out of your life, this is definitely something you want to figure out how to get into your budget. But to give you a hand with that, right now, if you use the coupon code Homesteading Family 2026, that's all one word, no spaces, all caps, you're going to get 15% off your order. Isn't that cool? So that's one use per customer because it's such a good deal. And remember, they even have a 2-year money back guarantee. So definitely go check them out. I want to jump in right now because I made some pretty big claims about bread and bread being something that really teaches you something about homesteading. When we're dealing with really industrialized products, when we're dealing with things like boxed milk that has been homogenized and ultra pasteurized, we can expect that it's always going to behave the same in our kitchen, regardless of the weather, regardless of the humidity, of the temperature in the kitchen, there's all of these different things that can affect something that's alive in your house. But when you're dealing with like a dead industrialized product, you don't have all those issues. This is something that I did not understand when I started making bread. I thought way back, wow, that was a long time ago now. Way back then, I kind of thought that you just got a recipe and you followed the recipe and your bread turned out predictably. I did not realize that because you're dealing with yeasts and they're living things, whether you're talking, a commercial yeast or a sourdough, a wild yeast, both things, they're alive. If you want to make bread that turns out consistently great, isn't super finicky, doesn't just, give you great bread one day and then terrible, crumbly, not sliceable bread the next day, you have to actually realize that you're working with something living and you have to have I don't know the best way to describe this. What I think of is it's almost like a conversation, right? You're having a conversation with your bread dough and you're making adjustments based on what you're saying. I like to call this reading the dough. So you're not reading a recipe, but instead you're reading a dough. And I'm going to jump into a little bit more of what that looks like in a minute. But I think it's just so important to understand why bread is like the gateway skill to homesteading. And I think it's because it really opens our mind to this. If you just force a set of directions on some bread dough, you're never going to end up with the results that you want. The way people try to counter that, they're like, it's not turning out the way I want. So they try to get more scientific and they break out their scales and their gram measurements and all of these things to try to really dial down the science of bread. But the reality is it's a living thing, and there's a lot more to it than we can break down in a simple formula, which is why if you've ever tried making bread and you tried following a recipe and it just doesn't seem to consistently come together, this is exactly why. But this is so true of so many other things on the homestead, whether you're talking about gardening, you're talking about fermenting, you're talking about livestock, anything like that. We can take these principles of how to handle it, but as soon as we try to make those things formulaic, we start getting frustrated because it just doesn't work. It's like making your spousal relationship formulaic, right? All of a sudden, it's not working at all anymore because you're like, oh, if I just do this and then I do this, then I get this good result. And we both know when we try to apply that concept to humans, into relationships, the other person feels it, right? They're not actually feeling cared for. They're not actually feeling heard or understood. What they're feeling is like they're kind of a piece of an equation. Your chickens behave that way. While they may not know it consciously like another human will, they don't just neatly fit into some formula. Your garden plants, same thing. We try to break it down into this really simple, if I do this and I do that, then therefore I'll get this good result. And the reality is there's just too many different things for that. And need to develop this feedback loop that says, if I do this, it responds this way. If it responds this way, then I respond accordingly. And when you start understanding that, when we step out of that, industrialized process, and no longer is it just this exact formula based on these exact things, then all of a sudden the homesteading world kind of opens up and it starts to make more sense. And you start being able to read things and use your common sense to adjust rather than just trying to go back and force some sort of formula on there. The other thing I want to talk about really quickly is that this is something that can be learned. I have heard so many people say, I don't have that talent. This is so true of bread making. If you were back on the COVID-19 like sourdough binge where everybody's trying it, you heard a lot of people go, yep, that wasn't my thing. I don't have that talent. When we're talking about bread and we're talking about bread kind of as this conversation or as this feedback loop, what you have to realize is it's actually a set of techniques. It's not a talent. Anybody can make bread. Okay, they just have to learn a set of techniques and they have to learn this concept that you have to actually read the dough. You have to look at the dough, see what the dough is doing. They have to learn the technique of what to identify and then what action to take based on that. So, this isn't something mysterious. It's not something that like you have the talent or you don't have the talent. It is something that you do need to look at a little bit of a different way and you need to build in the technique for actually working with your dough. Now, I do want to tell you guys, I'm going to jump into some of the essential techniques right now. I know a lot of you guys are much more visual than you are audio learners. You want to actually see these this month. I don't know if we've even told you guys here on the podcast, but every single month over at Homesteading Family, I am doing a free training, which is really exciting. And this month, here in February, it happens to be on bread. So I'll actually be getting into showing you in video form every single step of making good bread, of the techniques that you need in order to be able to read your dough in a way that's going to allow you to make great bread every single time consistently, no matter what is changing in the environment, no matter what recipe you're using. Because again, this isn't about a formula. This isn't about, having the right recipe. And that's a trap we all fall into. I think as new bread makers, a lot of times we'll have a failure on our bread. And our first thought is, well, that recipe didn't work out. Let me go find another recipe. The reality is you can make great bread no matter what recipe you're using when you start following that feedback loop, when you start learning how to read your dough, and when you start using the technique. And the ingredients is just a way to give you a different flavor in your bread, really, is what it is. I'll have a link for you for that free training video that we're going to do. It's a live video, live training. I'll be there live teaching, and you can watch it in replay if you can't make it live, but you do need to be all signed up and registered for that. Don't worry, it's free. There's no cost involved, so you can just jump in. Let's dive in to some of the essentials of technique. Now, first off, one of the major mistakes that people make when they're starting to make bread is by following that actual recipe and using the amount of flour that a recipe says. But here's the thing. I have now made bread in 3 different corners of the United States. I've made it high altitude, dry environments. I've made it in low altitude, really humid environments. I've made it in between. I've kind of done it all over the place. And the reality is that environmental factors, like your atmospheric factors that are happening in your kitchen and in your area at large, really affect what's happening in your bowl and with your dough. And they're affecting it so much that sometimes you need way less liquid or way less flour, and sometimes you need way more. If you go and say you're making a recipe and you're trying to follow exactly a recipe that somebody made, maybe they're in New England on a really humid day, that's when they're doing all the recipe testing, and you're down in the Southwest and you're in the desert of Arizona somewhere, and you're trying to follow their recipe for what was going on in their kitchen that day with their specific ingredients, you are going to run into problems because your dough might need way less flour because you're in such a dry environment. So here's the exciting thing though. You don't need to learn how to adjust the recipe. What you need to learn is how to read your dough, which just means you're watching your dough and you're only slowly adding flour until your dough starts to pull this together. I like to call this my flour saturation test when we know that you have the right amount of flour in. So, my recommendation to you, stop following a recipe when it comes to how much flour to add. Get your liquid, all your other ingredients into your bowl first, and then slowly start adding your flour until all of it starts to form into a ball and it's only slightly tacky. You don't want it dry, you don't want it crumbly, but you don't want it soggy, wet, or super sticky. You just want it to come together into a nice, tacky, where it has a little bit of that feeling, a little bit of that stick on your fingers, but not like it's going to completely coat your hands and fall apart. It can still be held into a ball. And this is the first step of reading your dough. Again, you're leaving that formula behind. You're saying, hey, thank you, recipe, for all these great ingredients. I'm going to take you up on using all the ingredients except for the amount of flour. That I'm going to do all by myself. Okay, so you get it to that space, that place where your dough has come together and it's nice and tacky. So another place where people really struggle with the technique is when you're kneading your dough and you're actually developing the gluten. And this is another place, like, it is surprising to me how many people are over kneading, whether they're doing it by hand or they're doing it by machine. This works whichever way you're making bread. When I started making bread, I had this sense that, oh, I'm going to have to knead it forever. This is going to take, half an hour, 45 minutes of me standing there and just kneading, 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 kneading. What I didn't realize is I was vastly over kneading my dough when I did that. And I was actually ruining my bread. I was making it very dense. I was making it crumbly, very brittle by doing that. So, again, what we need is a way to read our dough so that we can actually tell when am I done kneading? Not just guess, not just be like, well, I don't know. Most recipes will say something like knead until smooth and elastic. And for me, that is a very hard thing, even though I've been making bread for years. If you're making 100% all purpose flour, white flour dough, then yeah, you can figure out smooth and elastic pretty easily. Like it really does get smooth and elastic. But if you're like me, that's not the kind of bread you're looking to eat. You want something that actually has some fiber, actually has the whole grains in it. And as soon as you do that, it gets much harder to identify what smooth and elastic looks like. So I have something that I use that's called the window pane test. And again, I want to remind you, if you want to see this in video instead of just listening audibly, then jump over and join me for that live training because I'll actually be showing it to you. But to describe it the best I can, the window pane test is just a time where you take your dough that you've been kneading and you do this after just a couple minutes of kneading, because again, most people are over kneading their dough. So you knead for just a couple minutes and then you pull off like maybe, something that's the size of like a walnut or a golf ball size amount of dough. And you slowly start working at trying to stretch it as thin as you can get it. Now, it's called the window pane test because your goal is to get it to where it's so thin you can see light through it. But if your dough, when you're doing that and you're working with it and you're trying to stretch it out, if it tears, then you'll know that you haven't developed your gluten enough and your bonds aren't strong enough, and you need to go back to knead it a little bit more. You do that again, you knead it for about another 3 to 4 minutes. Stop and you do another window pane test. You stretch it and see, can I see light through it before it tears? If you can, then you know you're ready to move on. Stop kneading it there. Do not continue to knead it because there is a very real problem that happens if you over knead your bread or over knead your dough. And that's where a lot of people get into trouble. If you're using a mixer to make your bread, this is what I do all the time. I don't tend to make bread by hand because usually we're making like 6 loaves at a time in my house. And so it's in a mixer, it's working away. You just turn your mixer off, pull out a little bit of dough and check it. And usually if you're using a mixer, you want to check it after the first 1 to 2 minutes of kneading. It really does not take as long as you think most of the time. Once your dough passes that window pane test, you'll know that you're ready to move on to the next steps. This is usually letting your bread dough rise. And again, this is another place where it's like the recipes say something like, let it rise until doubled. Well, that's great. But if it's laying on in a like lump on my counter, I don't know what doubled looks like, especially if it takes a while to do it. Even if it's in a round bowl, that can be really hard to measure. What does double look like? Heaven forbid you've got a recipe that says let it rise and it gives you a time, like let it rise for an hour. And I have to tell you, in my experience, as soon as you change environment, your humidity levels, and as soon as you go up in elevation, all of a sudden your amount of rise time varies drastically. I have seen the exact same bread recipe take 20 minutes to rise and take over an hour to rise in different locations. So never, never, never go by the clock. If you have a recipe that says to go by the clock, get rid of the recipe or just completely ignore those parts of the directions. Because what you want to do is you're actually testing your yeast to see if it has risen as much as it will rise. Okay. And this is important to note because even doubling is just kind of guessing what it should do. So there's a really much more reliable method for testing this. And this is something that I like to call the poke test. And this is where you take your bread dough that you think has risen enough. Maybe you're watching it and you're like, oh, that kind of looks like maybe it's getting close to doubled. And you go over and you take your 2 fingers, your pointer finger and your middle finger, and you just poke right into your dough. And then you watch the dough's reaction. If those 2 finger hole pokes just fill right back in, if they just kind of swell right back up, and before long you can't see much of a dent at all, then you'll know that your bread dough has not risen enough. It still has way too much elasticity. It can rise a lot more and get you a much better end result in your bread. But if you poke your fingers in and it just kind of like lightly comes back a little bit, like it bounces back just a little bit, but then it doesn't fill in, that's when you know that your bread dough has risen to just the right amount. And that lets you move on to the next step. So you can see there are these little pieces, these little tests, these little techniques that you can use to start actually kind of having this conversation with your bread dough that says, hey, are you ready to move on to the next step? Nope, I'm not ready yet. Okay, we'll just keep doing this for a minute. Or are you ready to move back on? Yep, I'm all ready. Not to over characterize something that's not a human in our household, but it's this kind of a process and this kind of a feedback loop that lets us take any recipe, any bread recipe, and turn it into something that's always going to be a consistent result because you're automatically making all of the adjustments you need in order to compensate for the hundreds of different factors that go into how your dough behaves. So this is exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this conversation, when I'm talking about reading the dough. All of a sudden, you're not guessing anymore. You're not overworking your dough. You're not feeling like I'm the only person who can't make this bread turn out right, but instead you're looking at the dough and you're making the adjustments that you need, which means it's always going to turn out consistently. So remember, if you're feeling nervous about stepping into bread making, if you feel like you've tried it before and you haven't gotten the results that you want, try using these techniques. The way that usually looks is you take the recipe and you pay attention to all the ingredients except for that amount of flour, but then you throw out the directions. You ignore the directions and you follow this kind of technique-based directions instead. So again, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, "Okay, this makes sense, but I think I need to see it to totally understand what we're talking about." That's exactly why I'm doing this bread training this month, where I walk you through these techniques on video. I walk you through all the steps of making bread so that you can throw those directions out and start using whatever recipe you want to make this consistently great bread. You're not guessing, none of that. I'll show you the actual steps. If you're interested in doing that, then jump on over to homesteadingfamily.com/podcast dash bread. Again, that's homesteadingfamily.com/podcast dash bread. And it'll get you the link for getting all signed up for this free training. And I hope you'll join me because we really dive in. And it's one of those things when you walk away from this training, you will be able to walk straight into your kitchen and start making great bread. So I'll be super excited to have you guys there. And I hope you guys have a great week. We'll be seeing you next week. Goodbye.